It's very important to understand that strategy is a product of strategic thinking. It is not the same as strategic thinking. So we always need to start with contextual analysis. And I say start, I only mean a beginning there, and you keep returning to it because you need to continue to understand what the context is. And if that context changes, you've got to change possibly the vision, maybe, but definitely have to change the strategy very often because it just won't match up. So what is strategy? In the diagram, you see that at the top of the pinnacle is the end. So we know what the end is in this from the very first moment of the XCOM with the president. And he says, we will take these missiles out of Cuba. Okay, so we know that's the end, and a lot of other ends come into it, but that's clearly the strategic intent. And now what do? Well, ways and means. And down the bottom legs of the isosceles triangle, you see on the left-hand side ways. Well, what are ways? People have forgotten what ways are. The committee is on ways and means. Well, ways are very important. They are the principles of action that you take. They are the agreements. They are the policies. They are the treaties. I mentioned Rio Treaty. I mentioned Monroe Doctrine. All of the procedures and all of that standard historical, cultural underpinning for the support of the means that you're going to take. Now, what are means? Well, means are all the physical things, the people, the resources, the facilities, the equipment, the logistics, in this case, the planes and the ships and the people and the training and bringing all that to bear through the principles, the ways you apply the ways and the means to achieve the end. So that's what's happening as we move up this pyramid to come to the end game, as it's often talked of. So when you're thinking about strategy, what else do you need to think about besides the end, the ways, and the means? Well, you need to understand what your assumptions are about the situation. Now, when you're thinking through decision making, you also have to project yourself into the shoes of the adversary or of those with a counterforce, if that's all it is, or even someone just with a contrary opinion. What is he or she thinking? So in this case, we have to make some assumptions. Probably the Soviets thought this young president is not up to the job. He had the Bay of Pigs 2 months after he becomes president. The Vienna summit shows weakness, or appeared to be showing weakness on his part. And we think that here we put up the Berlin Wall. There was no reaction to it. Yeah, it was walling off our sector, but it was in the middle, in Berlin. And we know, in 1948 there was a Berlin airlift and so forth, but we didn't have any reaction to that. And then there was this opportunity. We know that they have nuclear weapons in Turkey, so that's not that far from Soviet Union. So why don't we put some close to the shores of the United States? And this president may not do anything about it. And if he does, well, what's the worst that could happen? We'll remove them. And maybe we'll get something else out of it. I'm not sure that that was the thought process, but that's what folks were thinking about. What does Khrushchev have in mind? After all, this is the same Soviet premier who was banging his shoe on the table or the desk up at the UN, I think in 1960. There's the same Soviet premier that had a history of drinking a little bit too much, of having fanciful flights. And there is, of course, in this case, in the communication, the whole issue of letter number 1 or letter number 2, and then the wisdom in the case of the Kennedy administration of answering the right letter. So what are the assumptions that we can make about the young president and the assumptions about Castro and the assumptions about Khrushchev? Castro, was he just a puppet for the Russians? Also, what are the assumptions here about missiles? We have mutual assured destruction, but remember, it's 1962. Okay, we're all familiar with all the calculus and so forth that really came from the economists of cost-benefit analysis, first strike, second strike, and all that. That's all sort of religious and liturgical, and you have to know all the steps, but you hope the other guy knows the steps as well. So whether or not that played in the calculus, probably not a lot, because the Soviets didn't have very many intercontinental ballistic missiles. Another dimension, the interests. In whose interest is all of this, and why would this strategy be important? Well, in this case, what is really the end game for the Soviet Union? Is it really all about Berlin? Would you go through all of this in bringing these medium-range ballistic missiles, bringing the bombers, bringing 100 tactical nuclear weapons, bringing battalions of Soviet troops to the island of Cuba, 90 miles off the coast, if all you were doing was setting up a chess game in which you take the Allied sector of Berlin in exchange for Cuba? Is that all it was about? Well, it didn't happen that way, and in fact, Berlin recedes into a lesser position, really, from that point on. So whether or not that was the original calculus, we actually don't know. But in whose interest? What are they thinking anyway? You find a lot in the literature, 13 Days, Bobby Kennedy's diary of the times, that they really couldn't come to grips with what are they really thinking? What do they really want? Then the objectives. Now, in NISL, we often talk about the strategic goal, and we like to use that word goal for the highest level. But there are many sub-objectives as you go through in achieving a vision. So you're moving along milestones and various objectives, and one objective can build on another objective. And so you have to be very careful that those objectives are aligned and coherent with the final goal. Capabilities. Okay, they're 90 miles off the coast now. What is the force of conventional forces? Okay, they brought nuclear forces in, but Soviet Union is a land power. And so when the senior folks are thinking this through, they're looking at the Soviet Union and saying, I know Russia. Russia's a land power. It will be significant to them that we have the logistics tail of 90 miles and they have the thousands upon thousands of miles to resupply and to have a logistics chain to the island Cuba. That will be very important to the Soviet Union. So you have those capabilities issues that are conventional forces, not just nuclear forces. And so we have the Air Force moving tremendous numbers, hundreds upon hundreds of tactical aircraft to Florida. And those would play a role in taking out the air defenses as the conventional aircraft move against the nuclear sites. Then there are the threats. Okay, a threat is what can happen. With an invasion, what could happen? With retaliation, what could happen? And the risk is on the other side of the threat. They shouldn't really be confused. The risk is all about what do you do if it does happen? What's the damage? What are the ill effects? And what's tolerable? You don't want any damage, but what's tolerable? And what can you do in retaliation? What can you do in retaliation that could prevent the original attack in the first place? And how do you mitigate risk? One way to mitigate risk on a population, obviously, is to move it. You can't move 100 million people. The panic in the country would be incredible. You can't get them out of the range of the medium-range ballistic missiles, so that's not a possibility. Possible courses of action. That's an important place to linger on strategies. Those who want to give you the answer right away are probably not the ones you want to bring into your close counsel if there is time for deliberation. There are those who move quickly to action, and as I said earlier, leaving out thought. There are those who stay just for strategies and don't return to context and don't recheck with the vision. There are those who don't align decisions and actions to achieve the strategic end. So we want to be very, very careful. But courses of action and alternative courses of action are a sign of a rational process of decision making. Those courses of action sometimes come from the standpoint of whoever is making the recommendation. So when I was dean at National War College, behind my desk on the bookcase, I had an old tin pot helmet from World War I, and on the other side of the shelf, I had a top hat. And what was that all about? Because we were always mixing in the calculus diplomacy and force, diplomacy and force. And we had to be very careful about that mix and what you reach for. And you don't automatically reach for the top hat. You don't automatically reach for the tin pot. But you reach for the tool that you do need as you apply the instruments of state power. And so you in a school will reach for the instruments that you have at your hand, or you can reach out to obtain those resources, working with the ways to achieve the end, and that end is the vision that came from an analysis of the context. So that's a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm sure you'll enjoy working the Cuban Missile Crisis at your table and in your deliberations. And what's important now is to make all the applications to the situations that are in your schools or to decisions that you've had to make. What's important, again, is to exercise yourself and the group in the conceptual framework: context, vision, strategy, decisions and actions. And I'll also talk a little bit about decisions and actions. Thank you.